And today we have three esteemed speakers, Mr. Professor Brahma Chellaney, Mr. Tempa Gyaltsen, and however, one of our speakers, Mr. Nakminder Dahal, he couldn't join us for the conference due to some visa issue. However, Mr. Mark Sithrit, who is a researcher at World Fish and based in Cambodia, he will be joining us online. And also we have Ms. Piampon, who couldn't join us today morning session due to some technical issue. So she'll be joining with us for this session. And because of that, we need to extend time for another half an hour. And so before we begin with our session, I would like to briefly introduce our speakers. So first we have Professor Brahma Chellaney. Professor Brahma Chellaney is a geostrategist, scholar, author, and a commentator. And he brings a rigorous and interdisciplinary lens to global strategic issue, including natural resources geopolitics. And he has been affiliated or worked with many institutes in New Delhi, in Berlin, and in London. And he has also served as a member of policy advisory group headed by the Foreign Ministry of India. And then we have a second speaker, Mr. Tempa Gyaltsen. He is currently pursuing his peace and conflict studies at the University of Innsbruck. He was a former research fellow and also a former director of Tibet Policy Institute. So, and then we have third speaker, Mr. Mark Sithrit. And title of his presentation is the Social and Ecological Transformation of Tunnel-Shaped Lake. So since he is based in Cambodia, this tunnel-shaped lake is one of the biggest freshwater lake within the Mekong River Basin. So he'll be speaking on this tunnel-shaped lake. And Ms. Piampon, she's a campaign coordinator of International Rivers, Thailand. And since 2002, she works to protect, restore the Mekong and Salween rivers ecosystem and rights of the local communities. So I would like to request Professor Brahma Chellaney to begin his talk.
Thank you, Dechen. This sound quality is better. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dechen, for the introduction. It's always very difficult to speak after lunch in the final session on a serious subject, especially if you don't have a sense of humor. My presentation will be quite flat on a very serious subject, but I will, try my best to keep you awake. And I'm going to look at two questions that are central to this conference. We have been discussing since yesterday Tibet as the water tower of Asia. Now, what makes Tibet the water tower of Asia? What's so special? What are the special characteristics of Tibet that it has become Asia's water tower? That's my first question. The second question also that relates to the theme of this conference is, how is the ecological impairment that is happening in Tibet affecting global warming? Now, before I proceed, let me just clarify one thing, that when I mention Tibet in my presentation, I'm not referring to the Tibetan autonomous region, that is the cartographically dismembered Tibet as China presents in its maps. The Tibetan autonomous region is only 50% of the Tibetan plateau. The Tibetan plateau is a very distinct geographical and ecological zone. So whenever I'm referring to Tibet, I'm referring not to the gerrymandered Tibet, but to the entire Tibetan plateau. Now let me begin with a basic fact. Tibet is unique. Tibet has the rarest medicinal plants, the highest living primates on earth, and species not found anywhere in the world. This includes plant, bird, mammal, reptile, and fish species. Tibet has the world's tallest mountains and also the world's steepest and longest canyon. In terms of water resources, Tibet plays a triple role. It is Asia's main water repository, Asia's largest water supplier, and Asia's principal rainmaker. Equally important is another fact, which is that Tibet, as the world's highest plateau, is critical to combating global warming. But global warming in turn is affecting the ecosystems on the Tibetan plateau. Along with the two polar regions, the Tibetan plateau is the most vulnerable region to the effects of global warming. This is in large part to the fact that the Tibetan plateau has not only this unique topography, very high topography, but also unparalleled landscapes. It has landscapes that extend from the tundra to the tropical jungles, ecological zones that go from the Arctic to the subtropical. It has endangered and endemic species. A combination of this makes the Tibet plateau extremely vulnerable to the effects of global warming. Tibet, in fact, is both a driver and amplifier of climate change. And accelerated climate change, in turn, has a direct bearing on Tibet's ecosystems and biodiversity. Less known is a third fact. Tibet, by deflecting wind outward in winter and inward in summer, influences not just Asia's weather and climate patterns. Tibet also influences the entire northern hemisphere's atmospheric general circulation. Atmospheric general circulation is a system of winds that helps transport warm air from the equator to higher latitudes, thereby giving rise to different climate zones. So Tibet is very much integral to the weather and climate patterns, not just in Asia, but also across the northern hemisphere. As you know that Asia's monsoons are unique. No other continent has a monsoonal system. And the Asian monsoons extend from the Korean Peninsula and Japan to Southeast Asia, Southern Asia. In fact, they cover the Arabian Sea region, extending up to the eastern sections of Oman. So much of Asia is covered by the monsoons. Tibet plays a very important role in bringing about the monsoons in the summer. It acts as a high elevation high elevation heat pump that draws in moisture-laden currents from the East and South China Seas, Indian Ocean, and the Arabian Sea. In the summer, the rocky and lofty terrain of Tibet heats up quickly in the summer and serves as a low-pressure system that attracts monsoonal currents from the east, southeast, and southwest. Simply put, Tibet's environmental well-being is critical to Asia, Europe, and North America, and to stemming climate change. In fact, one should regard Tibet's ecosystems as the ecological heritage of the entire northern hemisphere. This brings me to my next point. Environmental change is a stepping stone to climate change. Environmental degradation drives climate change. Environmental impairment is a very important contributor to global warming. Through the centuries, Tibet managed to maintain a pristine environment largely because of the nature-friendly Tibetan way of life. The Tibetan nature-friendly way of life put a cultural premium on maintaining human balance with ecosystems. Tibetans have long revered mountains, rivers, lakes, and glaciers as embodiments of deities and spirits. In Tibetan ethos, environmental mistakes once made need to be corrected quickly. For example, if trees are felled, then new trees must be planted as early as possible. But this balance, human balance with the ecosystems, has been changing since Tibet came under Chinese rule in the 1950s. And we know how China in recent decades has turned Tibet into the center of its dam building and mining activities. Today, Tibet is warming more than 3 times faster than the global average, according to international scientific studies, resulting in glacial recession, mostly in the eastern Himalayas, where human activity is concentrated. Glacial recession is not so much apparent in the western Himalayas, but it's largely apparent in the eastern Himalayas. Along with glacial recession, you have accelerated thawing of Tibet's permafrost, and both these developments are contributing to global warming. Scientific studies are also pointing to high rates of loss of genetic variability and extinction of species on the Tibetan plateau. Other scientific studies, including by Chinese scholars, have examined how large-scale deforestation in Tibet is contributing to impairment of fluvial, that is river systems, and also contributing to climate change. In the first session of this conference, we looked at water-climate nexus, especially the impact of climate change on water. Actually, it's a two-way connection. Water is very intimately connected with climate. Human-induced changes in hydrological cycle directly contribute to global warming, and global warming in turn has a direct bearing on water systems, creating a vicious circle, which once it begins, as it's already in process now, it becomes very difficult to break out of that vicious circle. Giant dams are affecting the hydrological cycle, and I'm not against dams per se. If you have environmentally friendly dams, it's one thing. I'm talking about mega dams, giant dams that actually change a river's ecology. Now, these giant dams on the Tibetan plateau are contributing to river depletion and even to recurrent droughts in downstream areas. And nowhere is this truer than in the Mekong Basin. And we can see the effects even here in Thailand as to how major dam building upstream is contributing to environmental damage in downstream communities. But there is also Two other aspects, two other effects that are so visible. One is the retreat of the Mekong Delta. This is visible if one visits the Mekong Delta in southern Vietnam, where farmers who used to cultivate rice now are shifting to shrimp production and to growing reeds. And then you're also seeing a disruption in the Mekong's annual flooding cycle. The annual flooding cycle is very important to naturally refertilize overworked soils. What happens with the flooding is that the flooding helps to spread nutrient-rich silt on farmland, and that enriches the soil every year. So when in the tropical areas, when the annual flooding cycle of a river is disrupted, this carries major environmental impacts. And we are seeing both these types of impacts in the Mekong Basin. Dams tend to create winners upstream by increasing access to water and hydropower, and losers downstream. So you have winners and losers from dams. But in the long run, what happens is that when you create these giant dams upstream, there can be no winners, because there'll be losers both upstream and downstream. So in the short term, yes, those upstream will be considered winners, but in the long run, there will be no winners. So we have to keep that in mind as to how this environmental and economic havoc is going to carry long-term costs. Now, there are two other aspects which I'm going to just mention in passing, because they also have an important bearing on the health of river systems that are flowing out of the Tibetan plateau. One is the large-scale commercial exploitation of mountain spring water. Bottlers are now tapping mountain spring water in a major way in the Himalayan region of Tibet. Now, mountain spring water is a perennial source of water for rivers. Rivers, they draw their water from where? They draw their water from mountain springs, glacial thawing, snow melt, and from rainwater. But what gives any river a special ecological characteristic is the fact that the mountain springs and the glacial thawing and the snow melt help the river system to carry silt, which is laden with nutrients, downstream. So when mountain springs are being tapped on a large commercial scale, it will certainly carry important ecological costs. The second development that really gets attention is geoengineering experiments to re-engineer rainfall patterns. Much of the rainfall in Tibet is concentrated in the southern and southeastern portions of Tibet along the international frontiers. Much of the other Tibet is largely arid. Now, what's happening in recent years is that Chinese scientists have been carrying out geoengineering experiments to bring about rainfall in the arid areas. Now, given the global interconnections of the climate system, when you have geoengineering experiments that draw in moisture from other areas, these experiments potentially can have an impact on stability of Asian monsoons and also potentially contribute to accelerated global warming. Now, in conclusion, let me end by making some broad conclusions. Climate security of the Northern Hemisphere is very much at stake because of the environmental and economic havoc on ecosystems that we are seeing in Tibet. And the ecological centrality of Tibet must be recognized in order to devise strategies to combat climate change. There's a vicious circle that we are seeing that is at play. Overexploitation of natural resources is contributing to an environmental crisis, and the environmental crisis in turn is contributing to climate crisis. In other words, there are three distinct interlinked crises in Asia: a resource crisis, an environmental crisis, and a climate crisis. Some argue that sustained international pressure needs to be mounted on China to reverse policies and activities that are contributing to ecological impairment. Unfortunately, international pressure on China is unlikely to work. What may work is something very different, which is to appeal to China's own self-interest. Appealing to China's own self-interest has a better chance of success than seeking to mount pressure on China. After all, saving Tibet is in China's own long-term interest. So the real issue is, how do you devise strategies that seek to persuade China that it's its own interest to help preserve the ecosystems on the Tibetan plateau? And I think it's very important to understand that persuasion has to be at the center of any approach to help reverse the ecological impairment that is becoming increasingly visible on the Tibetan plateau. But speaking more broadly, building climate security demands four different things. First is rules-based multilateral cooperation. Second is water-sharing agreements between and among the riparian states. Third is uninterrupted flow of hydrological data from upstream states to downstream states. And lastly, dispute settlement mechanisms, because disputes will arise even when they are basin arrangements. Transparency, collaboration, and sharing are the building blocks of environmental peace and climate peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Brahma Chellaney, for your comprehensive talk about the significance of Tibetan plateau. It plays its role in weather and the climate patterns of Asia and the world, and how critical the situation inside Tibet, and how one should regard Tibet as an ecological heritage of Northern Hemisphere, and all the destructive policies such as damming by the Chinese government have impact not only on the Tibetan plateau but also on the region beyond the border. And now I would like to request Mr. Tempa Gyaltsen to begin his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dechen. A very good afternoon to all. It's very difficult to speak after Professor Brahma Chellaney with so much information, expertise. And I'm really, really honored to be here on the stage with Professor here. And anyone who has walked on the waters or the rivers cannot do without reading Professor's books. So this is exciting, and this is an honor. Now, my presentation may not be as smooth as it should be, because I made some major change at the last minute so as to avoid repetition of many of the facts, because we all are speaking on our common theme. So I hope this would still remain interesting. So what I would be speaking about is examining challenges and achievements of Tibetan global environmental and climate advocacy. I have been pondering about at what stage has the Tibetan environment advocacy has arrived. Someone who has worked in it, but has taken a break of 2 years. I got the time to think about it, so that if we look at the past activities, we can plan future activities accordingly. Now, next. Now, so what I will try to do next. All right. So, yeah. So,
That's it.
yes. Okay. Now, last two days we have heard so much about Tibet Plateau as the roof of the world, the third pole, and water tower Asia. And then when you hear so much, you kind of start to think that, or start to question that, why is Tibet Plateau not getting its due recognition, or the kind of discussion that should be carried on global stage? But however, in the last few years, there is a drastic shift. And the shift is there are more and more experts beginning to speak on the Tibetan environment issues. There are more and more governments beginning to publish policies on Tibet's environment issues. And there are more and more books, more and more news articles, more and more research papers, and more scientific papers coming out regularly on Tibet's environment issues. So, so what I try to do is to try to understand what led to this shift. At one point of time, there were one or two people, one or two institutions that was the only voice or only source of Tibet's environment issues. But now there are multiple agencies, multiple institutions, and numerous experts and government officials and policy papers that are coming out on Tibet's environment issues. So I cannot analyze all the factors, but I will try to focus on one particular factor, and that is the effort or the contribution made by Environment and the Development Desk, the organizer of this very conference, the 4th Tibet Environment Conference. And when you look at the works and the activities of the Tibet Environment and Development Desk of the Tibet Policy Institute, you can categorize into three particular events. That is the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, and the second is 2009 Copenhagen COP50 UN Climate Summit, and finally the 2015 Paris Climate Summit. Now this is very interesting. So if you do some careful analysis, you can categorize in 3 stages. The first stage, this is my own term that I just kind of created. So a stage of learning and publication. That's from 1992 to 2009. And the second stage is stage of local and international awareness campaign from 2009 to 15. And then the third stage of leading and shaping discussions from 2015 and to 2023. Now, the first stage can be understood particularly with the 2 important aspects. That's during the first stage, that's the beginning of the stage where Tibetans are beginning to study, beginning to realize its importance. And that's when they are beginning to do research, beginning to do studies, and beginning to translate scientific papers into Tibetan language or bringing out more and more publications. And this effort was accelerated with His Holiness the Dalai Lama's participation at the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. And the stage 2, with participation in COP50 in 2009, saw a drastic shift from a publication and learning. It shifted to participation at UN climate summits. Now because we have enough knowledge, we have enough resources, now we are participating at climate summits, UN international conferences, to meet delegates, to meet experts, to meet politicians, and to explain to them why Tibet is so important. This shift started with the COP15, and from COP15 onwards, there was systematic, continuous participation at UN climate summits. And stage 3 is very interesting. It's a stage where we are kind of gaining a little more confidence. So it's the stage where we are beginning to lead and shape the very narrative. That is by organizing conferences. So if you organize conferences, you own the narrative. So that's with many of the institutions. So we started to, beside publication and participation, we started to organize events ourselves. And that began with the Paris Climate Summit in 2021. Next. Now I would like to focus a little more on the stage 1, that is the learning and publication period from 1992 to 2009. Now, this period can be summarized into 6 important points. And number 1 is His Holiness the Dalai Lama's participation at the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, the 5-point peace plan proposal in 1987, the Strasbourg proposal in 1988, Nobel Peace Prize in 1989, and the establishment of the very office, Environment and Development Desk in 1990, and the publication of the very first Tibet Environment book in 1992. Now, next. Now, this is a picture of His Holiness the Dalai Lama's participation at the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. And His Holiness was invited by Parliamentary Earth Summit, a major environment group. And during His Holiness visit, this is a tiny quote from the long speech His Holiness gave. His Holiness stated, "I believe that to meet the challenge of our times, human beings will have to develop a greater sense of universal responsibility." Now, this is very important. Universal responsibility. So there is a personality as prominent as His Holiness beginning to speak about universal responsibility. And so this kind of gained massive international attention. And it continues states, each of us must learn to walk not for his or herself, family or nation, but for the benefit of all mankind. Now, His Holiness' participation at the Rio Earth Summit kind of brought attention to Tibet's environment issues. Now, why His Holiness was invited? His Holiness was invited for the reasons that I will mention in my next presentation. Now, His Holiness was invited not because he was just popular. It's not just he was a prominent personality. He was invited because he advocated environment conservation long before international global community there was a surge in global community's interest in environment. Now, this is something called a 5-point peace plan, which His Holiness proposed at the U.S. Congressional Human Rights Caucus in 1987. And in this 5-point peace plan, the point number 1 and point number 4 are very, very important. And the point number 1 says, transformation of whole of Tibet into a zone of peace, both man and nature. And the point number 4, the Dalai Lama states, restoration and protection of Tibet's natural environment. So this proposal was given long before 1992 Rio Earth Summit. And that proposal continued with His Holiness' address at the European Parliament in 1998, popularly known as Strasbourg proposal, in which His Holiness said, it would be the government of Tibet's goal to transform Tibet into our planet's largest nature reserve. This is very important. As something Professor Brahma Chellaney also said, Tibet is the nature's heritage. So His Holiness has proposed the preservation of this nature's heritage. That was in 1998. And in 1989, His Holiness was the first Nobel laureate to be awarded on environment as well. Besides human rights and conflict resolution, the press release or the citation from the Nobel Committee states that the Dalai Lama's, sorry, it's very tiny. In the opinion of the committee, the Dalai Lama has come forward with constructive and forward-looking proposal for the solution of international conflicts, human rights issues, and global environment problems. So he was the first ever Nobel laureate to be awarded on environment issues. And just a year after His Holiness was awarded Nobel Peace Prize, Environment and Development Desk was established in 1990. And the goal of the Environment Desk was to publish books, disseminate information, educate students, and also reach out to international community and make them aware of Tibet's environmental issues. And these are some of the publications that were produced, and any Tibetan environmentalist might have grew up reading some of these books, because in the earlier years, there were very few books on Tibet's environment. And these are the kind of source of information that each one of us needed. And the first book was published in 1992 and distributed, inaugurated in Rio itself. Now, next. Now, then there was a shift in 2009. From publication of books, we shifted to participation at UN climate summits. So it was beginning in 2009 with participation at the COP15. From then on until 2023, we have successfully participated at almost all UN climate summits. Now the participation has added great value to it, because we were able to meet government officials, delegates, scientists, environmentalists, and we were also able to meet Chinese delegates. I personally, and Dechen and others who participate, and the lot of scientists here also, we were able to meet Chinese delegates, because some of the Chinese delegates are real environmentalists. There's a great interest in protection of Tibet's environment. So we were able to communicate. And we were also able to raise issues. And this participation has helped us in bringing Tibet on the global stage. And this has forced the Chinese to bring Tibet's environment issue at the UN Climate Summit itself. So after our participation, they have started to bring Tibetans to speak at UN Climate Summits. And they also started to organize side events on Tibet's environment issues. Of course, the narrative is different. Next. Now the third stage. Now, after 20 years or so in Tibet environmental works and activities, the Environment and Development Desk has gained knowledge, experience, and some degree of confidence. That's where we started to organize conferences ourselves, publish policy recommendations. So the first public policy paper, or the call to action, was the 10-point call to action that was produced in 2015, just ahead of the COP21 in Paris. And from then on, there has been many important international conferences that we were able to organize. And the first Tibet Environment Conference was held in 2015 in collaboration with University of Delhi, and where we had 12 experts, both Indian and Tibetan. And the second Tibet Environment Conference was organized in 2019 in collaboration with FNVA, where we had 13 experts from 7 different countries. And the third Tibet Environment Conference was held in 2021, initially in collaboration with the Tibet office in Taiwan. We were supposed to hold the conference in Taipei. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic and the lockdown, we had to shift online. And for that conference, we had 17 experts from 12 countries, including 2 parliamentarians, one from Czech Republic and another one from the UK. And of course, then the fourth Tibet Environment Conference that we all know. As per my count, there are 21 experts from 6 countries. Of course, organizers would have more accurate numbers. In parallel to Tibet Environment Conference, there's something called Tibet Climate Action Activities and Conferences, and which also began in 2015. So first Tibet Climate Action Campaign began in 2015 in Paris, where we had side discussions, events, and skits. And then the second climate action for Tibet was held in Madrid in 2019. The climate action events were organized parallel and with the participation at the UN Climate Summit. Now next. So this next, can you go one page up? There's a picture. Oh yeah. So these are some of the pictures of Tibet's environmental conferences and climate action campaigns. And you would see some of the pictures, Professor Brahma Chellaney, Dr. Lobsang Yangzo, and Dechen, some of whom you could see here in these pictures. Next. Now, the 2015 Tibet Climate Action and Tibet Climate Environment Conference was a major success because it was at this point, in October 2015, we organized something called Build Up to COP21, where we gained massive international attention. And some of the, just Google, you get all those up here. So that's when there was a massive response to our 10-point call to action. So if you get time, the 10-point call to action also has what we have been emphasizing, common approach. And in the 10-point call to action, I think one of the speakers quoted His Holiness yesterday, where this blue planet is our only home. And this quotation was granted to us, to the Environment Desk in 2015, where we requested His Holiness for a video message. Next. Now, the conclusion. During last 30 years of Tibet's environmental activities, there were challenges, there were success, and there were also issues that we need to acknowledge. And the challenge, of course, the biggest challenge was Tibetan experts, inability of the Tibetan experts to go to Tibet and do ground research, because we were not allowed. So we have to depend many of our information coming out from the Chinese scientists or international experts. And then, of course, the information that we receive from Tibetans in Tibet. And the other challenge was the difficulty of getting accreditation from UN, accreditation to participate at UN climate summits. And then the political pressure on governments or the institutions that organize environmental conferences where they want to invite us. And finally, there's this always overcautiousness and self-censoring by some experts and environment politicians. Now, I think the success is more important here. The success was that since 2009, there has been successive participation of Tibetan environmentalists at UN climate summits from 2009 onwards. Initially, it was always 1 or 2 staff from the environmental desk. But in recent years, since 2015 onwards, there has to be other organizations and institutions taking part in UN climate science. So environment desk no longer needs to go there because there are other Tibetans participating. So that's one success. And the major success was the IPCC publications, assessment reports begin to include the report on Tibet's glaciers, rivers, grasslands, permafrost, Tibetan nomads. So this is a major success from our 30 years of environmental work. And then there are more and more politicians and governments coming out with policies on the need for protection of Tibet's environment. And of course, then there's the Chinese bringing, as I said, bringing delegates at the COP conferences to speak about Tibet's environment. Now, what we need to acknowledge, we definitely need to acknowledge the Chinese glaciologists and nature scientists working on Tibetan environment and nature, because there's some massive resources coming out from China, from Chinese scientists. No, not politicians, Chinese scientists that we really need to acknowledge their contribution. Then the Tibetan government in exile, or CTA, and the Tibetan NGOs, and the support groups, and then the other experts who work or speak on Tibet's environment. Then also there's increased awareness and also increased information. And then there, of course, there's increased funding, which is why we are able to organize such conferences, because there's increased information that leads to increased interest. Increased interest leads to increased funding. That's why we are able to organize such conferences. And finally, it is also a result of consistent, focused, and continued effort by many, but one particular office was the Environmental Desk of Tibet Policy Institute. Now with that, I want to conclude with 2 points from the 10-point call to action. The number one 10-point call to action says, recognize the global ecological importance of the Tibet Plateau and make it central to global climate discussion. It's difficult for us to negotiate with the international delegates, but we want them to hear, and we also have, we raise this at the global climate events. And number 2, all riparian states, this is what we are here for. All riparian states in Asia dependent on Tibetan rivers should collaborate to study the ecological importance of the Tibet Plateau and its possible implication to the respective riparian or the adjacent regions. Now this is very important because there's some discussion saying that all the implications are not as serious as it is stated. So best is to collaborate, and we all do a collective research and try to understand, is Tibet Plateau really important? So that we Tibetans do not have to come out and say that, but you, respective states, do the research yourself. Like in Thailand, try to do research on the Mekong River and what's happening in Tibet on these particular rivers. In Pakistan, the Indus and Satluj rivers. Try to do this research on the source of these rivers. What's happening there? Is there any implication? In India, Brahmaputra and other rivers. And so there are many Tibetan rivers, not only rivers, climate impacts. And there are other issues that have implications for other regions. With that, I think I will conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tempa Gyaltsen, for sharing the overall journey of environment and climate advocacy work of Tibetan, especially His Holiness Dalai Lama in